Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really dark but absolutely crucial piece of human history. We're going to unpack exactly how and why European colonizers made a massive shift in their labor forces. We're looking at the specific economic and legal drivers that literally built a brand new system of human exploitation.
So here's the big question that frames this entire explainer. Why did colonial planters completely replace temporary indentured servitude with an unprecedented, permanent system of racialized slavery? I mean, what were the specific turning points that made them abandon one system for another? By digging into this, we're going to uncover the chilling economic math that forever altered the modern world.
To get to the bottom of this profound shift, here's our roadmap. We'll start with early colonial labor systems, look at the limits of indentured servitude, trace the shift to African labor, examine the brutal Middle Passage, see how race was actually codified into law, and finally, look at the incredible resistance and enduring cultures of the people trapped in this system.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, Early Colonial Labor Systems and the Initial Demand for Labor.
Picture the early 17th century. The English colonies are absolutely desperate for workers to grow lucrative cash crops, like tobacco. So who did they turn to first? Well, they relied heavily on two main groups. First, Native Americans, often captured during conflicts like the Pequot War or King Philip's War, or just taken in illegal slave trade raids. Second, they used impoverished English laborers. Basically using Elizabethan poor laws, planters created indentured servitude. Folks would work for 4 or 5 years just to pay off their Atlantic passage. And the sheer scale of this early native enslavement, it's honestly staggering. Historians estimate that somewhere between 24,000 and 51,000 Native Americans were forced into slavery in the southern colonies between 1670 and 1715. Many were even shipped out through Charlestown to places like Barbados and Bermuda. Moving on to Section 2, the limits of indentured servitude and the planters' search for stability.
You see, the planters quickly hit some massive roadblocks with these initial labor forces. It was full of friction. For one, native populations suffered terrible mortality rates from newly introduced diseases. Plus, they resisted fiercely, and enslaving them caused massive diplomatic headaches with neighboring tribes. On the flip side, English indentured servants were temporary. After 4 or 5 years of backbreaking work in the tobacco fields, their contracts were up. They went free, and the planters had to scramble and pay to find replacements.
And the planters, they absolutely hated this turnover. There's this simple, chilling phrase from our historical sources that hits the nail on the head. They were desirous of a more stable workforce. That captures the horrific economic calculation they were making. They didn't want workers who would eventually go free, and they didn't want workers who could easily escape into familiar territory. They wanted a permanent solution. That demand for so-called stability brings us right to Section 3, the shift to African labor, to create a permanent workforce. When you compare the two, the primary economic draw for the colonizers was permanence. While indentured servants had legal rights and a set end date, enslaved Africans could be held for life. For the planters, this turned human beings into a permanent capital investment, an investment that was even heritable by children, eventually defined by completely new racial categories. And that cold, calculated economic decision resulted in an agonizing human toll. To fill this endless demand for permanent labor, an estimated 11 to 12 million Africans were forced across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries. 11 to 12 million people. Let's move into Section 4, the brutal Middle Passage, covering the journey and the plantations. We hear the term Middle Passage a lot, but it was actually just the middle leg of 3 distinct, unbelievably grueling journeys. First, captive Africans were forced to march hundreds of miles overland to coastal slave trading factories. Then came the oceanic trip itself, the Middle Passage, which could last anywhere from 1 to 6 agonizing months. Finally, upon arrival, they faced what colonizers called seasoning, a brutal process of acclimatization and transport to their final destination at an American mine or plantation. The conditions on these ships were, frankly, unimaginable. Let's look at the British slave ship Brooks. Even after a 1788 law tried to regulate conditions, a grown man was allotted a space just 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches. Before that law, traders packed in up to 609 people. Captives were literally chained in rows in the hold, in spaces barely larger than a coffin. They lost skin and flesh right down to the bone from chafing against metal and timber, while diseases like dysentery ran absolutely rampant.
And if they survived that horrific journey, the danger was far from over. In the Caribbean, sugar was incredibly profitable, but it had to be processed within 3 days of harvesting. This meant the mills ran nonstop. Listen to this quote from Barbados planter Edward Littleton. "If a mill feeder be catched by the finger, his whole body is drawn in and he's squeezed to pieces. If a boiler get any part into the scalding sugar, it sticks like glue." It's a terrifying glimpse into the lethal reality of 18-hour shifts, where people face the constant threat of being crushed or boiled alive. This brings us to Section 5, Codifying Race in Law, and the actual invention of racial ideology. To maintain total control over this highly profitable, lifelong labor force, the colonizers needed new rules. So, they essentially invented modern racial ideology through the legal system. And it happened fast. In 1636, the Barbados governor announced Africans and Indians would be held in bondage in perpetuity. By 1661, the Barbados Slave Code officially characterized Black people as chattels, meaning property. Then, a massive turning point in 1662. A Virginia law made the condition of slavery heritable from the mother. This ensured that any child born to an enslaved woman was trapped for life. It was a calculated legal move to lock in their workforce.
But it's really important to realize these racial concepts weren't universal everywhere at the time. Look at the Spanish in neighboring Florida. In 1693, they issued the Decree of Sanctuary. They literally granted freedom to enslaved people fleeing the English colonies, provided they converted to Catholicism and swore loyalty to Spain. It highlights an entirely different colonial framework and really shows just how constructed and artificial those English legal definitions of race truly were.
Finally, let's look at Section 6, Resistance and Enduring Cultures and Humanity Amidst Exploitation. Despite facing extreme, crushing oppression, enslaved laborers constantly resisted their exploiters. This wasn't passive. They fought back in so many ways. On the plantations, they'd organize work slowdowns, feign illness, or break tools to hit the planters' bottom line. Sometimes they went on strike over poor conditions. In colonial cities, some managed to hire themselves out for a tiny bit of economic independence. And of course, many took the incredible risk of running away, sometimes even joining up with European servants, or meticulously organizing and planning massive rebellions. But beyond resistance, they built lives and enduring communities. They formed lasting families, sometimes marrying abroad, which meant across different plantations, and they'd walk miles just to visit their spouses on Sundays. They forged communal bonds through Sunday festive celebrations and fused African and European practices into completely novel Creole cultures. We're talking about the introduction of African foods like cassava to the Americas, the preservation of West African rhythms and melodies in music, and the continuation of Gola basket making and language. Against all odds, they ensured their cultures survived and thrived. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. As we've seen today, the shift from temporary indentured servitude to permanent racialized slavery was driven by a cold, calculating desire for a stable, highly profitable workforce. Knowing that modern racial ideology was legally invented and codified purely to solve an economic labor shortage, how does that change the way you view the legacy and structures of these systems in our world today? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.